Native Americans didn't just throw together a few poles and hides and call it a home. The teepee was a masterpiece of portable engineering, something that could be built in hours yet survive storms that could tear down wooden cabins. To understand how they pulled this off, you have to step back into the process long before a single pole was raised on the prairie. It all began in the forest, with the search for the perfect trees. Finding the right poles wasn't luck. It was a skill, one sharpened through generations of observation. Scouts could walk into a forest and, with a single glance, know which trees would outlast the storms of winter. The prize was lodgepole pine, tall, slim, and straight as if nature had designed it with teepees in mind. But even then, timing was everything. Winter was the season of harvest, when the sap ran low and the wood would dry stronger, less likely to warp or rot. Imagine trudging through knee-deep snow in biting wind, knowing every wrong step wasted precious energy. Yet families did it, year after year, because survival demanded it. Cutting down one of these trees wasn't like swinging a steel axe from the hardware store. The tools were stone and bone, shaped by hand and sharpened with care. Every strike of the stone axe had to be deliberate, each chip of bark and wood slowly surrendering to human determination. Felling a tree this way could take hours. It was exhausting work, but when the tree finally groaned and toppled to the ground, it wasn't just lumber, it was life itself. But the job had only begun. Raw pine carried bark and moisture that spelled disaster if left alone. Rotting poles could collapse a shelter in the dead of night, so tribes set to work immediately with scrapers carved from stone and knives fashioned from bone. They peeled away bark and flesh of the tree until only clean pale wood remained. This wasn't glamorous work, it was painstaking, methodical, the kind of labor that tested patience as much as strength. Yet every stroke of the scraper meant a safer winter. Preparation didn't stop there. The poles had to be dried, stored, and protected from the very elements they were meant to defend against. Families stacked them carefully off the ground, keeping them flat and covered, waiting weeks or months for moisture to slowly seep away. Too fast, and the wood would split. Too slow, and rot would creep in. It was a delicate balance, one guided not by written manuals but by generations of lived knowledge passed from elders to the young. Some families treated poles like heirlooms. A set of seasoned poles might travel with them for years, dismantled and reassembled across plains and valleys, through snow and heat, proving themselves storm after storm. A well-kept pole was more than wood, it was part of the family's history, a silent witness to births, celebrations, and winters survived. When the time came to move, transporting poles was its own test of ingenuity. 20-foot logs weren't exactly backpack-sized. Without trucks or wagons, people relied on teamwork and animals. Before horses were common, humans themselves bore the weight, carrying or dragging poles over miles of uneven ground. Later, horses and dogs became partners in the work, hauling poles in carefully balanced bundles. It wasn't easy. Imagine threading a bundle of massive pine poles through dense forest trails, every snag and twist of the land threatening to derail the mission. Yet they made it work, again and again. The real magic began when those raw poles transformed into a frame. The teepee skeleton wasn't a haphazard pile of sticks, it was precision architecture. The first step was choosing 3 poles for the sacred tripod. These weren't chosen at random. They were the straightest, strongest, most trustworthy poles, the foundation that every other piece would lean on. Getting this wrong wasn't an option. If the tripod failed, everything failed. Raising that first tripod was an act of skill and balance. With rawhide ropes, cut, cleaned, and twisted from buffalo hide or woven from plant fibers like dogbane, the 3 poles were lashed together near their tops. Then, with practiced rhythm, families heaved them upright, spreading the bases wide to form a stable foundation. Around and around, more poles followed, each set carefully at the right angle, each gap measured by instinct and experience. This wasn't trial and error. Every family knew exactly where each pole should go, how far apart, how high, how the curve of the circle would determine the space and strength of the shelter. By the time the last pole was set, what stood before them was more than just wood. It was a frame that could bend with prairie winds instead of breaking, a structure that combined strength with flexibility. In less than an afternoon, families could create a frame that would stand against storms strong enough to flatten fields. And yet, as impressive as this wooden skeleton looked, it was nothing without its skin. The buffalo hide cover that would turn a frame into a home. But that was another story, one that demanded as much sweat, courage, and knowledge as the poles themselves. The frame of poles might have been strong enough to laugh at the wind, but without its covering, a teepee was nothing more than a wooden skeleton. What transformed that structure into a warm, weatherproof home was the skin of the buffalo. And preparing that covering was one of the most demanding, time-consuming, and skillful tasks in Native American life.
First, of course, came the hunt.
Buffalo were more than food, they were the raw material for survival itself. From tools and clothing to rope and glue, nearly every part of the animal was used. But the hides, those were priceless. One family's teepee might require 10 to 12 buffalo hides stitched seamlessly together, a wall of leather tough enough to withstand snow, rain, and howling winds. Imagine the scene. After a successful hunt, the massive carcass of a buffalo is laid out, and the real work begins. Fresh hide is heavy, slippery, and thick with hair and fat. Women of the tribe, who were masters of hide work, set to it immediately. With stone scrapers sharpened to an edge, they began removing every trace of flesh from the inside. This was grueling labor, hours bent over the hide, muscles straining, hands working rhythmically until the inner surface was smooth and clean. One mistake, one patch left uncleaned, could mean rot setting in months later. Then came the outer surface. Every strand of coarse buffalo hair had to be scraped away. Imagine trying to shave a carpet with nothing but a stone blade. That was the scale of the challenge. Special scraping boards helped, but the task still demanded relentless energy and precision. The women doing this work weren't just preparing material, they were securing their family's survival. Once scraped, hides were soaked and stretched to soften them. Brain matter, rich with natural oils, was often used in tanning solutions, creating a process that modern chemists still marvel at. Stretching a buffalo hide took multiple people, pulling in all directions, tightening it on wooden frames so it would dry smooth and flat. Too tight, and it would tear, too loose, and it would wrinkle and warp. This was part science, part art, refined through centuries. And one hide was never enough. To cover a single teepee, hides had to be matched, trimmed, and prepared to fit together like pieces of an enormous puzzle. Women measured by eye and hand, laying hides side by side, trimming edges until the pieces fit just right. The goal was to make a seamless cover that would shed rain and snow like a roof of shingles. The sewing began next. Forget needles from a sewing kit. These needles were carved from bone, strong and sharp enough to pierce thick leather again and again. The thread was sinew, the dried tendons of animals, split and twisted into cords that were stronger than anything store-bought. Sinew had one miraculous property: it tightened when wet. That meant stitches made with sinew actually grew stronger with time and weather. Every seam pulled tight, waterproof, and unbreakable. Picture the work: hours of women sitting together, hides stretched across the ground, bone needles punching through leather, sinew pulled taut with each stitch. The sound of scraping, pulling, tightening, it was the rhythm of survival. Children might play nearby, but everyone knew this was serious work. The difference between a strong seam and a weak one could be the difference between a family sleeping dry through a storm or shivering all night in the cold. The finished cover was massive, a single sheet of leather large enough to drape over the skeleton of 20-foot poles. It could weigh 50 pounds or more, heavy and awkward, yet precious beyond measure. It wasn't just shelter. It was the family's shield against the brutal winters of the plains. But the cover had to be portable, too. Families moved often, following the buffalo herds or shifting camp with the seasons. That meant folding and unfolding these enormous hides again and again. Every fold had to be careful, precise, to avoid creating weak points. Families developed exact methods for folding the teepee cover, ways taught by elders and repeated generation after generation. Buffalo hides also had to be weatherproof. Even the tiniest crack or thin spot could leak under rain or snow. So every cover was inspected, reinforced, and tested. Weak seams were stitched again. Thin areas were patched with smaller pieces of hide. Nothing was wasted. Scraps became lashings, ties, or repairs for other equipment. And yet, despite all this preparation, attaching that heavy cover to the frame was another challenge altogether. Raising a buffalo hide cover onto a teepee was like dressing a giant in a storm. Several adults worked together, lifting and draping the massive piece until it hung evenly. Rawhide laces tied it securely to the frame, pulled tight in special patterns that spread stress evenly across the hides. Wooden stakes hammered into the ground anchored the bottom edge, while heavy stones were sometimes used for extra weight against fierce winds. Then came the finishing touch: the smoke flaps at the top. These weren't afterthoughts. They were the teepee's ventilation system, the difference between warmth and suffocation. Made from the same buffalo hides, they could be opened and closed with long poles, adjusting airflow as winds shifted. With a well-tended central fire, smoke rose and drifted out through the flaps, while warmth stayed inside. It was central heating and air conditioning in one, designed without a single nail or brick. When all was done, the result was astonishing. A structure built in hours, from raw poles and heavy hides, stood ready to protect an entire family from snow, rain, wind, and cold. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a home, a fortress, a piece of living culture. And the knowledge behind it, the way hides were prepared, stitched, folded and mounted, wasn't written in books. It was passed down by word, by demonstration, by the patient teaching of mothers to daughters, generation after generation. The teepee cover was more than leather. It was tradition, engineering, and survival stitched into one. And once it was in place, the bare frame of poles was transformed into a living space, a circle of warmth and community in the middle of the endless plains. With the poles raised and the heavy buffalo hide secured, a teepee looked strong from the outside. But step inside, and you'd find it wasn't just a shelter against the storm, it was a carefully organized home, designed with as much thought as any modern house. The very heart of that home was the fire. Always placed in the exact center, the fire pit was shallow and carefully dug. Rocks lined the edges, holding back the flames, while the smoke rose straight up toward the opening at the top. Those smoke flaps, controlled by long poles, worked like a switchboard. A slight adjustment here, a shift there, and smoke cleared while warmth stayed inside. Families didn't need thermostats. They had something better, knowledge of wind, air, and fire that had been refined through centuries of survival. But warmth from above was only half the battle. Beneath, the frozen ground waited to steal heat from anyone lying too close. Native Americans solved this with remarkable ingenuity. First came mats woven from willow branches, thick layers that raised the floor off the dirt. On top of that, bundles of dried grass were laid down, insulating the ground even more. Then came the animal skins, thick buffalo hides near the edges, softer deer or elk skins closer to the fire where people sat or slept. Step into a teepee on a winter night, and the ground underfoot didn't feel like frozen prairie. It felt like a nest, warm and soft, built to hold life in the middle of a bitter landscape. Sleeping arrangements weren't random. Adults, children, and elders each had specific places. The most vulnerable, the very young and very old, were positioned closest to the fire, where heat was most even. Adults slept on the outside edges, forming not just a family circle, but a living barrier against cold drafts. Sometimes, several family members would huddle together under layers of fur, their combined warmth turning the teepee into a cocoon against the wind. Survival in the plains wasn't just about firewood or hides. It was about family, about sharing body heat, comfort, and vigilance. And yes, vigilance mattered. Winter wasn't only about snow and wind. Predators, hungry and desperate, prowled close to human camps. Wolves, cougars, even bears could be drawn by the smell of meat or the warmth of firelight. This was why dogs were so essential. More than companions, they were living alarm systems. A bark in the night could mean danger approaching. Families slept with weapons nearby, bows, spears, knives, all placed within reach. Not thrown in a corner, but carefully arranged so they could be grabbed in a heartbeat. Imagine the discipline of living like this, every night a test, every dawn a victory. Daily life inside the teepee wasn't only about defense or warmth. It was also about order. Space was divided in ways that reflected both practicality and tradition. Opposite the entrance was often the honored place, reserved for the head of the family or important guests. Around the fire, tasks unfolded in rhythm, women preparing meals with stone and bone tools, children learning to sew sinew or carve wood, men repairing weapons or recounting stories of the hunt. The teepee was not just a shelter. It was a classroom, a workshop, a temple and a home, all in one circle of hide and pole. And unlike houses nailed to the ground, this home was meant to move. That was the true genius of the teepee. It was portable. When buffalo herds shifted or when seasons changed, families could pack their entire home and follow. The process was fast, efficient, and astonishing. First, all the interior items, skins, tools, food stores, were packed away. Each had its place, each wrapped or bundled for travel. The fire was extinguished carefully, ashes scattered so no trace remained. Stones from the fire ring were sometimes carried to the next camp, if they were particularly good for holding heat.
Then came the hide cover.
It had to be unlashed, folded, and packed with care. A mistake in folding could crease or weaken the leather. So there were traditional folding methods, repeated exactly each time, to keep the hide strong and ready for the next setup. Finally, the poles. Those towering 20-foot lengths of pine were unlashed, stacked, and bundled. Families with horses used travois, long poles attached to the sides of a horse, dragging bundles across the plains. Before horses arrived, dogs performed the same task, carrying smaller loads with astonishing endurance. When neither was available, the people themselves bore the weight. Either way, the teepee's design made sure nothing was wasted. Every part could be moved, reused, set up again. And when they arrived at the next camp, in just a few hours, the entire home was standing again. Fire crackling, hides tight against the wind, smoke rising into the sky. What might take modern campers days to achieve with nylon tents and metal stakes was accomplished with nothing but wood, hide, and skill. Think about it, a home that could be built, lived in, dismantled, carried, and rebuilt dozens of times in a single year. A shelter that kept families alive through storms that would kill the unprepared in a single night. A design so effective that even today, engineers study it as one of history's greatest portable structures. The teepee wasn't just architecture. It was a philosophy. A way of life built on balance, between strength and flexibility, between permanence and mobility, between individual skill and family cooperation. It was proof that survival in the harshest conditions didn't require endless tools or modern machines. It required knowledge, patience, and the ability to work with nature instead of against it. And that's why, centuries later, the sight of a teepee still captures the imagination. It represents not just survival, but ingenuity, resilience, and a connection to land and family that modern homes, rooted in cement and brick, can only dream of.